April 17th, 1987. A date that is etched in the memory of every sports fan in Arizona, not because of a buzzer-beating shot or a championship parade, but because of the flashing lights of police cruisers. Imagine the scene. The scorching desert sun is beating down on the Veterans Memorial Coliseum, a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary for heroes. But on this specific Friday, the sanctuary had turned into a crime scene. The news didn't just break, it shattered the peace of the entire state. The Phoenix Suns, the darlings of the desert, were no longer just athletes fighting for a playoff spot. Suddenly, they were suspects. The headlines screamed betrayal. The faces that smiled from cereal boxes and billboards were now being hidden behind sunglasses and legal counsel. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. This was a catastrophe that threatened to tear the National Basketball Association apart from the inside out. At the center of this storm stood men who had it all: money, fame, and adoration. Yet they were risking everything for a thrill that came in a small plastic bag. But among the chaos, one figure stood out. A giant of a man with a mustache that made him look like the ultimate movie villain, a man they called Buddha. His name was James Edwards. And while the world was quick to point fingers and scream, "Guilty," the story of what actually happened behind those locker room doors is far more twisted, far more tragic, and infinitely more fascinating than the evening news ever dared to report. Fasten your seatbelts, because we are about to peel back the curtain on the scandal that nearly destroyed a franchise and the man who walked through the fire to come out the other side a champion. To understand the magnitude of this earthquake, you have to understand what the Phoenix Suns meant to the city in the late 80s. They were not just a team, they were the heartbeat of the community. In a town that was still finding its identity, the Suns were the biggest show in town. Families planned their dinners around tip-off times. Kids wore purple and orange to school with a sense of tribal pride. But on that fateful spring morning, the telephone lines at the Suns' front office began to ring, and they didn't stop. It wasn't fans calling for tickets. It was the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. And the message they delivered was cold, precise, and utterly devastating. The grand jury had handed down indictments. The word indictment hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. We are talking about serious charges: trafficking, conspiracy. These are words you expect to hear in a report about organized crime syndicates, not about the starting lineup of a professional basketball team. The shock was visceral. People stopped in the streets. Office workers gathered around radios. It felt personal. It felt like a stab in the back. The rumor mill went into overdrive immediately. Who was involved? Was it the rookies? Was it the bench warmers? No. The rumors whispered names that were too big to fail, names that hung on posters in teenagers' bedrooms. The panic inside the organization was absolute. Jerry Colangelo, the man who had built the franchise brick by brick, looked as if he had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. The trust was gone. The locker room, usually a place of camaraderie and banter, became a silent tomb of suspicion. Every player looked at the man next to him and wondered, is he the one talking to the police? Is he the one wearing a wire? Because that was the most terrifying part of the initial shock. It wasn't just an outside investigation. The evidence was coming from the inside. The call was coming from inside the house. And as the day wore on, it became clear that the Phoenix Suns were facing an opponent they couldn't dunk on, and they couldn't outrun. They were facing the United States legal system, and the game was rigged against them from the start. In the middle of this legal hurricane stood James Edwards. If you were casting a movie about a tough, uncompromising enforcer from the wrong side of the tracks, you would cast James Edwards without a second thought. Standing 7 feet and 1 inch tall, he was a mountain of a man. But it wasn't just his height that intimidated opponents, it was his face. Specifically, it was that mustache. A long, drooping Fu Manchu that framed his mouth and gave him an air of permanent menace. He didn't look like a modern athlete with a polished smile. He looked like a warrior from a bygone era, or perhaps a henchman from a kung fu film who silently guards the final boss. But appearances, as we know, can be dangerously deceiving. Despite the terrifying exterior, those who knew him best called him Buddha. Think about that contradiction for a moment. A man who looked like he could crush a basketball with one hand was named after the symbol of peace and enlightenment. Why? Because James Edwards was quiet. He was stoic. In a league full of trash talkers and showmen, Edwards was the strong, silent type. He possessed a calmness that was almost unnerving. He didn't need to scream to make his presence felt. When Buddha stepped into the paint, people moved. He was the rock, the anchor, the veteran presence that was supposed to stabilize a young and volatile team. He had a touch around the basket that defied his size. His signature move, a fadeaway jumper from the post, was a thing of beauty, smooth, unblockable, and reliable. He was a professional in the truest sense of the word. He showed up, he did his job, and he went home. He wasn't known for wild outbursts or public spectacles. And that is exactly why his name on that indictment list caused such a jarring cognitive dissonance. James Edwards, the quiet giant, the man who kept to himself? It didn't fit the narrative. It was easy to imagine some of the younger, wilder players getting caught up in the nightlife, but Edwards was the veteran. He was supposed to be the adult in the room. Seeing his face plastered on the front page of the Arizona Republic under the word "scandal" felt like a glitch in reality. It forced everyone to ask a chilling question. If Buddha is involved in this mess, then truly no one is innocent. What was the quiet man hiding behind that stoic expression? To truly grasp how a man like James Edwards ended up in the crosshairs of a narcotics investigation, we have to hop into a time machine and go back to the National Basketball Association of the 1980s. It was a different universe. This was before the billion-dollar TV deals, before the 24-hour social media surveillance, and before players were treated like corporate brands that needed to be protected at all costs. The 80s were the Wild West. The money was starting to pour in, exploding from a trickle to a flood. And with that new money came a tidal wave of excess. The league was riding high on the rivalry between Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. But underneath the glamour of the Showtime era, there was a dark, gritty underbelly. It was an era fueled by adrenaline and, quite often, by substances that kept the party going long after the final buzzer sounded. In nightclubs from New York to Los Angeles, VIP sections were awash in champagne and snow. It was the era of the high life, in the most literal sense. The white powder was everywhere. It was a status symbol, a party favor, and for many, a way to cope with the grueling physical demands of an 82-game season. It wasn't just tolerated. In many circles, it was expected. The players lived in a golden cage. They were treated like gods, given free access to the best tables, the fastest cars, and the most dangerous company. Security was lax, and the line between the professional athletes and the local hustlers was often blurred. You have to understand the pressure cooker these men lived in. They played hard, physically beating each other up night after night, and then they went out looking for relief. The culture of the locker room was a fortress of silence. What happened on the road stayed on the road. There was an unwritten code of omerta that was stronger than any contract. You didn't talk about another man's business. You didn't ask where he was going after the game, and you certainly didn't ask what was in the small package he slipped into his pocket. This was the water James Edwards swam in. It was a toxic, seductive ocean where the Sharks wore expensive suits and promised the world. The Phoenix Suns were not unique in this regard. They were just the ones who got caught. The lifestyle had seeped into the foundations of the franchise. It started with a drink here, a late-night party there, and slowly, imperceptibly, the focus shifted from winning championships to chasing the next thrill. The players felt invincible. They were young, rich, and adored. They believed the rules of society didn't apply to them. They believed they could dance on the edge of the volcano without ever falling in. But in 1987, gravity finally caught up with the Phoenix Suns, and the fall was going to be long, hard, and public. If the basketball court was the stage where these men performed, then the nightclubs of Phoenix were the backstage where the real drama unfolded. To the average fan in 1987, Phoenix might have seemed like a sleepy desert town compared to the neon jungle of Los Angeles or the gritty streets of New York. But make no mistake, when the sun went down over the mountains, the city came alive with a different kind of heat. There were places, exclusive spots, hidden corners in dimly lit bars that served as the unofficial headquarters for the city's elite. And for the Phoenix Suns, one name kept popping up in the whispers: Malarkey's. It wasn't just a bar, it was a sanctuary for the high and mighty. Imagine walking in on a Tuesday night after a big home win. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and expensive cologne. The music is thumping, a heavy bass line that vibrates in your chest, drowning out the outside world. In the corner, surrounded by a phalanx of admirers and beautiful women, sit the giants of the court. They look like kings holding court. Waitresses glide back and forth with trays of drinks that cost more than a working man's weekly salary. But it wasn't the alcohol flowing freely that was the problem. It was what was happening in the shadows, in the restrooms, and in the hushed conversations at the back tables. This was the Arizona Coliseum of vice. Here, the strict rules of the NBA evaporated. In this hazy twilight zone, a dangerous ecosystem thrived. You had the players, desperate to unwind and numb the pain of a bruised body. And then you had the hangers-on, the sharks in cheap suits, the local hustlers, the people who didn't care about basketball but cared very much about being close to fame and money. They were the suppliers. They were the ones who could get you anything you wanted with a snap of their fingers. James Edwards and his teammates were rubbing elbows with characters who had no business being anywhere near a professional athlete. The tragedy of it all was the false sense of security. Inside these walls, the players felt untouchable. They believed their celebrity was a shield that no law enforcement officer would dare to penetrate. They thought that what happened at Malarkey's stayed at Malarkey's. They were wrong, dead wrong. Because while they were laughing, toasting to their success, and indulging in the white powder that fueled their nights, someone was watching. Someone was listening. The very people pouring their drinks or laughing at their jokes were not all friends. Some were eyes and ears for a force that was about to bring their world crashing down. The club wasn't a sanctuary, it was a hunting ground, and the players were the prey. The public believes that scandals explode overnight, but in reality, the fuse is lit months, sometimes years, in advance. The Phoenix police didn't just stumble upon James Edwards and his teammates. This was a calculated, cold-blooded operation. It wasn't a random traffic stop, it was a siege. While the players were practicing their free throws, detectives were practicing their surveillance techniques. They called it an investigation into gambling and narcotics trafficking, a phrase that carries the weight of a federal prison sentence. Let's look at the mechanics of this trap. It was terrifyingly efficient. The Maricopa County authorities had authorized wiretaps. Think about what that means. Every time a player picked up the phone to call a friend, to order a pizza, or to arrange a meetup, a tape recorder was spinning in a windowless room at the police station. Every intimate detail, every code word, every unguarded moment was being cataloged, transcribed, and filed away as evidence. The players were living in a glass house, completely unaware that the curtains had been pulled back for the whole world to see. The investigation centered on a man named James Crouch, a figure who bridged the gap between the criminal underworld and the glittering world of sports. He was the key. The police squeezed the small fish to get to the big fish. They used informants, people who had partied with the Suns, people the players trusted with their secrets. These informants were flipped, turned against their idols in exchange for leniency. It was a classic pincer movement. As the 1986 to 87 season wore on, the net tightened. There were close calls, strange cars parked down the street from players' houses, unfamiliar faces at the usual hangouts. A smarter criminal might have noticed the signs, the subtle shift in the atmosphere. But these weren't career criminals. They were athletes. They were used to being watched by fans, not by vice squads. They missed the signals. When the grand jury finally convened, the prosecutors didn't just have hearsay. They had hours of audio. They had dates, times, and locations. They had built a fortress of evidence so high that no amount of money or fame could scale it. The operation was a masterclass in patience. They waited until they had enough dirt to bury the entire franchise, and then they pulled the trigger. To understand why James Edwards, the stoic, silent Buddha, got dragged into this nightmare, we have to look at the man who was supposed to be the team's savior, Walter Davis. In the lexicon of Phoenix sports, Walter Davis was royalty. They called him the Greyhound because of his sleek, effortless speed. He was a six-time All-Star. He was the franchise's all-time leading scorer. He had a jump shot so smooth it looked like liquid silk. Fans adored him. He was the golden boy, the face of the franchise, the man you wanted your kids to emulate. But behind the dazzling smile and the silky smooth game, Walter Davis was fighting a war he was losing. He was the tragic epicenter of the scandal. While Edwards was the terrifying-looking enforcer, Davis was the beloved hero with a secret life that was rapidly spiraling out of control. His appetite for the chemical demon was voracious. It wasn't just recreational anymore. It was a necessity. The pressure to perform, to be the star, to carry the team on his back, night after night, it all fed into a cycle of dependency that was eating him alive from the inside out. The prosecution knew this. They knew Davis was the weak link. He was the domino that, if tipped, would knock down the rest. The tragedy of Walter Davis is Shakespearean. Here was a man who had the world at his feet, yet he was enslaved by a substance that didn't care about his scoring average. When the investigators closed in, they didn't go for Edwards first, they went for the icon. They targeted Davis because they knew his clean-cut image was a facade. The rumors around Davis had been swirling for years, whispered in the back channels of the league. Walter looks thin, people would say. Walter is sweating too much. Walter is jittery. But the organization protected him. They shielded their star. Until they couldn't. When the subpoena arrived for Walter Davis, it wasn't just a legal document. It was the shattering of an illusion. The hero was fallen. And in his desperation, in the terrifying face of losing everything, what would the golden boy do? Would he stand tall and take the heat? Or would he look around for someone else to share the blame? This was the moment the brotherhood died. The moment self-preservation kicked in, and standing right next to him, silent and imposing, was the perfect scapegoat, James Edwards. The interrogation room is a lonely place. It is a box designed to break the human spirit. For Walter Davis, the man who had heard thousands of fans chanting his name, the silence of that room must have been deafening. The Maricopa County Attorney, Tom Collins, wasn't looking for autographs. He was looking for a trophy. He laid the cards on the table with brutal simplicity: prison time or cooperation. For a man like Davis, who had everything to lose, his legacy, his freedom, his family, the walls were closing in fast. It was the classic prisoner's dilemma, played out in real life with millions of dollars at stake. This is where the story turns from a sports drama into a Greek tragedy. Davis was offered immunity, complete protection from prosecution. But immunity is never free. The cost was betrayal. To save himself from the wreckage of his own choices, he had to give up the names of those who stood beside him in the trenches. He had to break the sacred code of the locker room. Imagine the internal torture. These were men he showered with, ate with, traveled with, men who had passed him the ball when the game was on the line, and now he was being asked to pass them into the hands of the law. On April 16, 1987, the deal was struck. Walter Davis walked out of that office a free man in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of his teammates, he had become something else entirely. He had become the star witness. The ink on the immunity agreement was practically blood. By securing his own safety, he effectively signed the warrants for his friends. It was a move of desperate self-preservation. Davis later admitted to his struggles with dependency, painting himself as a victim of the lifestyle. But that didn't change the cold, hard fact. To keep his own jersey clean, he had to throw mud on everyone else. The Greyhound had outrun the law, but he couldn't outrun the shame. And the first person in the line of fire was the man who least expected it, James Edwards. When the indictments were unsealed, the shockwave was strong enough to register on the Richter scale. James Edwards wasn't just slapped with a fine or a suspension. He was charged with conspiracy to traffic and possess marijuana and cocaine. Let those words sink in. Trafficking. It sounds like something from an international cartel movie, not the resume of an NBA center. The prosecution painted a picture of a criminal enterprise operating out of the Suns' locker room. Alongside Edwards, younger players like Jay Humphries and Grant Gondrezick were also named. It was a sweep. For Edwards, the accusation was a hammer blow. Remember, this was Buddha, the quiet one, the man who supposedly kept his nose clean. To be accused of facilitating the movement of illicit substances was catastrophic. The public looked at his menacing mustache and his 7-foot frame and thought, of course, he looks the part. It was prejudice in its purest form. They saw a villain on the court, so they assumed he must be a villain off it. The media ran with it. They didn't need proof, they had a narrative. The big bad wolf of the Phoenix Suns was finally in chains. But dig a little deeper, and the kingpin theory starts to crumble. The specific allegations were often based on the testimony of informants who were trying to save their own skins, or on the word of Davis, who was under immense pressure to deliver names. Edwards wasn't accused of running a cartel. He was accused of being part of a social circle where these things happened. But in the eyes of the law in 1987, Arizona, there was no difference. Facilitating a transaction for a friend was treated with the same severity as selling on a street corner. The devastating part for Edwards was the betrayal of trust. He was being painted as a corrupter of youth, a veteran who led the rookies astray. He vehemently denied the trafficking label. He was a consumer, perhaps, a man of his time. But a dealer? That was a label that could end his life as he knew it. If the drug charges were a fire, then the rumors of gambling were the gasoline. In professional sports, substance abuse is a tragedy, but gambling? Gambling is the cardinal sin. It is the one thing that can destroy the integrity of the game forever. As the investigation unfolded, a terrifying whisper began to circulate through the back channels of the league. Were the Phoenix Suns shaving points? Did they throw games to pay off debts to local bookies? This was the nuclear scenario. The NBA office in New York went into full panic mode. The rumors centered on a specific game against the Milwaukee Bucks. The story went that the players, deep in debt to the wrong crowd due to their expensive habits, had agreed to keep the score within a certain margin. It was the kind of conspiracy theory that destroys leagues. If fans believed the games were fixed, the NBA would be finished. The investigation into this was aggressive. They looked at every turnover, every missed free throw, every strange substitution. Was Edwards missing shots on purpose? Was Davis passing the ball to the other team? This was the shadow that hung over James Edwards' darkest of all. Being called a user is one thing. Being called a cheater is another. It strikes at the very heart of an athlete's pride. Edwards was a competitor. He played hard every night. The idea that he would throw a game for money was insulting to his very core. Ultimately, the gambling charges against the players never stuck. The evidence wasn't there. It turned out to be smoke without a fire, fueled by the hysteria of the moment. But the damage was done. For weeks, every time Edwards stepped on the court, people wondered, is he trying to win, or is he trying to cover the spread? It was a psychological torture that no athlete should ever have to endure. The fix wasn't on the court. The fix was in the way the media convicted them before the trial even began. Imagine walking into your workplace, looking at the person sitting next to you, and wondering if they are wearing a wire. That was the reality for the Phoenix Suns in the spring of 1987. A locker room is supposed to be a sanctuary. It is a sacred space where the outside world is locked out, where grown men bond like brothers, sharing the triumph of victory and the bitterness of defeat. But after the indictments came down, that sanctuary was desecrated. The air inside the Veterans Memorial Coliseum wasn't filled with the smell of sweat and deep heat rub anymore. It was thick with paranoia. The team didn't just lose games, they lost their soul. How do you run a pick and roll with a man you think might be testifying against you in a court of law? The chemistry on the court evaporated instantly. Passes were a split second late. Defensive rotations were missed. The unspoken telepathy that makes a professional basketball team function was severed. The players split into factions. You had the clean guys who looked at the accused with a mixture of pity and fear, terrified that the stain would rub off on them. And then you had the outcasts, Edwards, Humphreys, and Gondrezic, who sat in their corners, isolated, wrapped in a silence that screamed louder than any words. And at the center of this toxic storm was the ghost of Walter Davis. Even when he wasn't there, his presence was felt. He was the elephant in the room, the man who had taken the deal, the man who had saved his own skin by pointing fingers. The sense of betrayal was visceral. In the unwritten code of the streets, and often in professional sports, there is no sin greater than turning on your own crew. The trust was shattered into a million pieces, and no amount of coaching or team meetings could put it back together. The Phoenix Suns were a dead team walking, a group of individuals wearing the same jersey but playing entirely different games. While the lawyers were sharpening their knives behind closed doors, the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. Guilty. The media frenzy was unlike anything Arizona had ever seen. You have to remember the context of the late 80s. The war on drugs was in full swing on television. Nancy Reagan was telling everyone to just say no. Society had zero tolerance for this kind of scandal, and the press fed that outrage with a shovel. James Edwards became the poster child for everything wrong with professional sports. His face, that stoic, unsmiling visage with the heavy mustache, was plastered on front pages next to headlines that screamed scandal, shame, and crime ring. They didn't paint him as a human being who might have made a mistake. They painted him as a thug. Reporters camped out on his front lawn. Cameras were shoved in the faces of his family members. Every aspect of his life was dissected, analyzed, and judged by people who had never met him. It was a character assassination of the highest order. And looming over all of this was the terrifying figure of David Stern, the commissioner of the NBA. Stern was a man on a mission to clean up the league's image. He knew that corporate sponsors were watching. He knew that if the NBA got a reputation as a haven for lawlessness, the money would dry up. He was furious. The threat of a lifetime ban hung over Edwards' head like a guillotine blade. Stern wasn't interested in nuance. He wanted to send a message. He wanted heads on spikes to show the world that the NBA was serious about discipline. For Edwards, this was the most terrifying part. It wasn't just about jail time. It was about his livelihood. It was about being erased from the history books, banned from the only thing he knew how to do. The pressure was suffocating, enough to break a lesser man. Finally, after months of agonizing speculation, the legal drama reached its climax. But it didn't end with a bang. It ended with the squeak of a plea bargain. The prosecution's case, which had been trumpeted as the takedown of a major syndicate, began to lose air when it faced the scrutiny of defense attorneys. The trafficking charges, the ones that carried the heavy prison sentences, were flimsy. They relied too heavily on the word of informants who had everything to gain by lying. The legal system, as it often does, became a game of negotiation. Edwards's legal team fought tooth and nail. They argued that he wasn't a dealer. At worst, he was a user who had been caught up in a bad situation. The grand conspiracy started to look more like a group of guys making bad choices at a party. Slowly, the terrifying charges were whittled down. The threat of decades behind bars receded. In the end, deals were cut. Grant Gondrezick took the hardest fall, pleading guilty to a felony charge that severely damaged his career prospects. But James Edwards? Buddha managed to navigate the minefield. He maintained his innocence on the most serious charges, but accepted a plea to a lesser offense to end the nightmare. He avoided prison. He avoided the chain gang. But the victory was hollow. The judge might have let him walk, but the damage to his reputation was done. He was a free man, technically. But in the eyes of the Phoenix Suns organization, he was damaged goods. He was a reminder of the darkest chapter in franchise history. They wanted to turn the page, and that meant they had to get rid of the characters in the story. Edwards packed his bags. The city that had once cheered for him now just wanted him gone. He was leaving the desert not as a hero, but as an exile. His career was at a crossroads. At 32 years old, with a scandal attached to his name, who would possibly want to take a chance on James Edwards? In the world of professional sports, you are only as valuable as your reputation. And in the summer of 1987, James Edwards's reputation was radioactive. The legal battles were technically over, the plea bargains were signed, and the threat of prison had receded like a bad dream. But the Phoenix Suns were done with him. Jerry Colangelo, the architect of the franchise, was a man of principle, and he decided to burn the house down to get rid of the rot. He wanted a fresh start. He wanted the faces of the scandal out of his city. Edwards was 32 years old. In NBA years, that is practically geriatric. He was a center with a bad back, a damaged knee, and now a permanent asterisk next to his name in the form of a drug indictment. He was damaged goods. The phone wasn't ringing. General managers across the league looked at his file and saw a liability. Why take a risk on an aging big man who might bring the police to your locker room? It seemed like the end of the road. The narrative was written. The Arizona scandal would be the final ugly chapter of his biography. But destiny has a strange sense of humor. On February 24, 1988, just as the trade deadline was looming, a call came through. It wasn't from a sunny paradise or a glamorous coastal city. It was from the grim, gray, industrial heartland of America, the Detroit Pistons. The Suns packaged Edwards like unwanted luggage and shipped him off to the Midwest. It wasn't celebrated as a blockbuster trade. It was seen as a salary dump, a disposal. Edwards packed his bags in silence. He was leaving the desert sun for the freezing winters of Michigan, joining a team that was notorious for being the most hated squad in basketball. Most people thought he was going there to fade away into retirement. They couldn't have been more wrong. To understand James Edwards' resurrection, you have to understand the Detroit Pistons of the late 80s. They weren't just a basketball team. They were a gang. They were the bad boys. Led by the baby-faced assassin Isaiah Thomas and the most despised man in sports, Bill Laimbeer, they played a style of basketball that bordered on assault. They didn't just want to beat you, they wanted to hurt you. They were the villains of the NBA, the black sheep that the league office desperately wished would disappear. And into this asylum of misfits walked James Edwards. With his terrifying Fu Manchu mustache, his stoic Buddha demeanor, and his history of scandal, he didn't look out of place. In fact, he looked like the missing piece of the puzzle. In Phoenix, his menacing appearance was a PR nightmare. In Detroit, it was a marketing asset. He fit right in with Rick Mahorn and Dennis Rodman. The bad boys didn't care about what the Arizona newspapers said about him. They didn't care about the grand jury testimony. They only cared about one thing. Could he help them win a war? The Pistons' head coach, Chuck Daly, a man who dressed like a GQ model but coached like a street fighter, saw something everyone else missed. He saw that Edwards still had it, that unblockable fadeaway jumper, that veteran savvy. Daly didn't ask Edwards to be a saint. He asked him to be a weapon. He gave him a specific role: come off the bench, post up on the low block, and punish the second unit of the opposing team. For the first time in years, Edwards wasn't looking over his shoulder. He was embraced by a brotherhood that thrived on being the outcasts. The jailhouse stigma that Phoenix tried to pin on him became a badge of honor in Detroit. He had found his tribe. The scriptwriters of reality are often better than Hollywood. It wasn't long before Edwards had to face his past. Playing against the Phoenix Suns wasn't just another game on the calendar. It was a reckoning. When he stepped onto the court to face the team that had discarded him, the atmosphere was electric with tension. But here is the difference between James Edwards and a lesser man. He didn't trash talk. He didn't give angry interviews to the press. He let his game do the screaming. Imagine the scene. Edwards catches the ball in the low post. He feels the defender on his back. Maybe it's a former teammate, someone who sat silent while he was being crucified in the media. Edwards does his signature move. He leans back, creating that impossible angle, high release, swish. Nothing but net. He runs back on defense without a smile, without a word. Just pure cold efficiency. It was psychological warfare. While the Phoenix Suns were struggling to rebuild their image, trying to find a new identity in the ashes of the scandal, Edwards was thriving. He was playing meaningful minutes for a championship contender. Every point he scored was a reminder to the Suns' management that they had made a mistake. They had thrown away a key piece of a championship puzzle. And what about Walter Davis, the man whose testimony had started the domino effect? Their paths diverged sharply. Davis was still putting up points, but his team was sinking. Edwards was rising. The villain was winning. The man they called a criminal was now a gladiator in the Roman Colosseum of the NBA Finals. It was the ultimate "I told you so," delivered not with words, but with a championship ring in his sights. History loves irony, and there is no greater irony in sports than the image of James Edwards in June of 1989. Just 2 years prior, legal experts were predicting that he might be trading his jersey for a Department of Corrections uniform. They said he was finished. They said he was a disgrace. But look at him now. He isn't standing in a courtroom listening to a verdict. He is standing in the locker room of the Great Western Forum in Los Angeles, drenched in champagne, screaming at the top of his lungs. He is an NBA champion. The Detroit Pistons, the bad boys, had just swept the mighty Los Angeles Lakers. They had dethroned the kings of the decade, Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And right in the thick of it was James Edwards. He wasn't just a passenger on the bus, he was driving it for long stretches. In the playoffs, when the game slowed down and became a gritty, half-court war of attrition, Edwards was invaluable. His post-game was a sanctuary for the offense. When Isaiah Thomas was double-teamed, he dumped it down to Buddha. Edwards would catch, turn, lean back, that beautiful, unguardable fadeaway, and silence the crowd. It was clockwork. It was professional. Think about the mental fortitude that required. Most men would have crumbled under the shame of the Phoenix scandal. They would have let the drug ring headlines define them. But Edwards compartmentalized it all. He took all that negative energy, all the whispers, all the judgment, and he channeled it into his right wrist. Holding that golden trophy, the Larry O'Brien Trophy, was the ultimate vindication. It was a message to every prosecutor, every reporter, and every doubter in Arizona. You tried to bury me, but you only planted a seed. He didn't just survive the scandal, he used it as fuel to reach the absolute pinnacle of his profession. And the best part? He did it again the very next year, back-to-back champions, from a suspect to a dynasty. But what about the other side of the coin? While Edwards was popping champagne corks, where was Walter Davis? The man whose testimony had set the whole house on fire? The Greyhound was still in the league, still scoring points with that velvet-smooth jump shot, but something was broken inside. He had moved on to the Denver Nuggets, trying to outrun his past in the thin mountain air. But the shadow of 1987 followed him like a curse. Davis had secured his freedom by giving up names, but he had lost something far more valuable: the respect of the brotherhood. In the eyes of many players across the league, he was marked. He was the guy who broke the code. When he walked onto the court, there was a coldness from opponents that went beyond competitive rivalry. It was personal. You could see it in their eyes, a look that said, "We know what you did." He was isolated. The camaraderie that makes team sports so special was gone for him. He was a mercenary now, playing for a paycheck, playing to keep the demons at bay. The tragedy of Walter Davis is that he was a victim too, a victim of his own addiction and a system that squeezed him until he broke. But in the ruthless narrative of professional sports, nuance is often lost. He wasn't remembered as the six-time All-Star who carried a franchise. He was remembered as the man who sang to the prosecutors. While Edwards was collecting jewelry and cementing his legacy as a winner, Davis was drifting. His stats were still good, but his impact was hollow. He played out the rest of his career in a kind of purgatory, talented, wealthy, but fundamentally alone. It was a stark reminder that while the legal system can grant immunity, the streets and the locker room never forget. If you look at the career arc of James Edwards, it defies all logic. Most big men in the NBA break down by the time they hit 30. Their knees go, their backs give out, and they fade away. But Buddha just kept going, and going, and going. He played until he was almost 41 years old. Think about that. He played in 4 different decades. He saw the era of Dr. J, the era of Magic and Bird, the era of the Bad Boys, and finally, the era of Michael Jordan. And that is the final incredible chapter of his redemption. After his time with the Pistons ended, after most people thought he would finally retire to a rocking chair, who called him? The Chicago Bulls, the greatest team ever assembled. In 1996, the year the Bulls won 72 games and lost only 10, look at the roster. There, sitting at the end of the bench, providing wisdom and a few crucial buckets, is James Edwards. He won a 3rd championship ring with Michael Jordan. He had transformed himself from a problem into the ultimate sage. He became the wise old owl of the NBA. Young players looked up to him not because of the scandal, but because he was a survivor. He knew how to take care of his body. He knew how to keep his mouth shut and do his job. He knew how to navigate the treacherous waters of fame and come out dry. The man who was once the face of the league's biggest drug scandal retired as one of its most respected elder statesmen. It is a testament to the power of resilience. He proved that a scandal is only the end of the story if you let it be. For James Edwards, it was just a plot twist in the middle of a masterpiece. It is 1997, and the NBA is different. It is slicker, more corporate, more controlled. The days of wild parties at Malarkey's and open secrets in the locker room seem like ancient history. And why? Because of what happened in Phoenix 10 years earlier. The James Edwards scandal was the earthquake that forced the league to reinforce its foundations. It wasn't just a blip on the radar, it was a watershed moment. David Stern, the commissioner who watched his league almost implode, used the Phoenix disaster as a blueprint for the future. The strict anti-drug policies, the rookie transition programs, the relentless image management, all of it can be traced back to the panic of 1987. The league realized it couldn't rely on the honor system anymore. They needed rules, they needed testing, they needed to protect their billion-dollar investment from the players themselves. James Edwards, without ever intending to, became the catalyst for the modern NBA's obsession with cleanliness. But there is a bitter irony here. While the league cleaned up its act, the players who were caught in the gears of that change were often discarded like broken toys. The new rules didn't help Walter Davis recover his dignity. They didn't erase the mugshots from the archives. The scandal became a cautionary tale told to every rookie class. Look at what happened to them. Don't let it happen to you. Edwards' name, for better or worse, became shorthand for how close we came to losing it all. He was the survivor of a shipwreck that changed the maps forever. And now we come to the end of our story, but not necessarily the end of the mystery. James Edwards retired to a quiet life, far away from the cameras and the courtrooms. He rarely speaks about 1987. When he does, it is with the weary wisdom of a man who has seen too much. But the question still lingers in the minds of those who were there. What really happened in that locker room? We know about the plea bargains, we know about the testimony, but we also know that in the world of professional sports, the truth is often stranger than fiction. Was Edwards truly innocent of everything, a victim of circumstance and bad friends? Or was he simply the smartest man in the room, the one who knew how to play the game, both on the court and with the prosecutors, better than anyone else? The gambling rumors, the specific details of the traffic, these are ghosts that were never fully exorcised. They were buried under legal paperwork and championship rings. James Edwards walked away with his freedom, his money, and 3 NBA titles. He won. In every sense of the word, he defeated the scandal, but he did it by keeping his mouth shut. He never wrote a tell-all book. He never went on a talk show to cry about his victimization. He stayed true to his nickname, Buddha, silent, enigmatic, and untouchable. Perhaps that is the greatest intrigue of all. In an era where everyone sells their secrets for 15 minutes of fame, James Edwards kept his. He took the truth with him, leaving us only with the legend of the villain who became a champion. And maybe, just maybe, that silence is the loudest statement of all. So, what have we learned from the strange, twisted saga of the Phoenix Suns scandal? We learned that heroes can fall, that villains can be redeemed, and that the line between a criminal and a champion is often decided by a single bounce of the ball or a single decision in a prosecutor's office. James Edwards is not just a basketball player. He is a survivor of a different time, a time when the NBA was wild, dangerous, and dangerously human. He stared into the abyss of prison and public shame, and he didn't blink. He walked through the fire and came out the other side holding the Larry O'Brien trophy. His story is a reminder that in life, as in basketball, it's not about how you start the game, it's about how you finish it. And James Edwards, he finished strong. But ask yourself this as the credits roll. If you were in Walter Davis's shoes, facing 10 years behind bars, would you have stayed silent? Or would you have done exactly what he did? And if you were James Edwards, watching your friend turn into your accuser, could you have found the strength to forgive, forget, and win? The answers might be harder than you think, because in the game of life, there are no referees to call the fouls. Only the final score matters. And James Edwards, the man with the villain's face, walked off the court a winner.